Welcome to Coffee with Captain Pete, bedtime stories with Bethune, depending on where you are in the world. We have an amazing guest today, Scott Countryman, who lives in the Philippines. He's got an amazing story, actually. In fact, you've got so many great stories. First off, we're gonna come to the work story first off. Now, last week's story takes a bit of beating. So Eric, my cameraman, who's 5 foot over there pressing buttons and fossicking around, his work story was he got kidnapped for 6 months by some gangsters in Mexico, held hostage, and had to come up with a reggae music festival before they would let him go. Your work story is also a cracker. Let's have your work story. It's kind of not really a work story, is it?
Yeah.
It's a cracker story.
Well, I've done different things in life, but between the boardroom stories, which aren't as interesting, and the call centers here in the Philippines, I worked briefly as a goat catcher. So I lived in Saipan in the Northern Mariana Islands, and there's an island about 130 miles north, an uninhabited island with an active volcano. I mean, it used to have people living there, but in the 80s a volcano erupted, and everybody had to be evacuated, but they had to leave their animals there. So there was cows and pigs that turned feral and goats, and a World War II veteran paid me to live on the island by myself and run around with a flashlight and catch these goats at night. And I had a Filipino guy that taught.
Why would you catch them at night? Why not in the day?
It was a lot of work to catch them in the daytime. I mean, the goats are pretty fast and the terrain's really rough, and so at night you can use a flashlight.
So you're on this uninhabited island.
Uninhabited island. Volcano erupting every day.
People got all evacuated.
Yeah.
And yet you went out there.
Yeah, you know, the volcano was more ash and steam and not so much like lava and stuff, so it was pretty safe. And I was on the lee side, so ash would rain down every day. But at night it was a lot easier to catch the goats. And so what I would do is I'd hold a flashlight out beyond the scope of my feet so the goats couldn't see me, and they'd just be blinded by the light. And I would get, you know, really close. So I guess my work story, if this is my work, is there was one goat that was bigger than all the rest. And as a competitive guy and as a hunter, I wanted to like catch this biggest goat. And I chased him probably a dozen nights halfway around the mountain trying to catch him. And then finally, I got close enough and I grabbed him. And the technique was to grab one, turn off your light, throw him under your leg, and then the other goats would come around, and then you get a double. And then
so you get 2 goats in
one. 2,
one.
sometimes 3. But then you wouldn't try to take them back to the camp with you. You'd tie them off to a small rope, and then the next day you'd come back in the daytime, there'd be all these goats tied to a tree, and then you would put them like Santa's reindeers. You'd put them in a big long line, and you take a long stick and just keep the one in the front running the right direction, and then you'd bring them all back like 10 at a time back to the camp and then put them in a corral.
So you're getting rid of these goats off this island for environmental purposes.
Nope.
But what? So
nope.
why are you doing it?
Because we flew them back to Saipan, and the local Chamorro people would buy them for about $20 a piece as lawnmowers to keep the grass in their and sometimes eat them too, but mainly for domestic animals back in Saipan.
Okay, so this big goat, you managed to catch him one day.
I got him by the horns, and he started like, you know, backing up, and he was big, you know, I don't know, maybe 80, 100 pounds, 120 pounds, and I lost my footing, and he started dragging me over the lava rock, and
We're pixelated in and out from birds. Don't worry, carry on, man.
So he's dragging me backwards over the rocks, and I wouldn't give up. And finally, I just had to let go. Gave up, and looking at my wounds in my elbows and my forearms where he'd dragging me over the rocks. And then in the night, and with my flashlight 20 feet away, I hear this clippity 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 clip, and the goat just laid his head down and hit me really hard in the back, and next day I'm pissing blood, and I think I've broken a rib. And you know, when you're out in the middle of nowhere with no cell phone signal or no hospital and nobody else to talk to, you have your moments when you realize that you're really completely independent, and you have to be a little bit more careful.
You were on a deserted island with a volcano that was active and spitting out ash on you every night. How was it living on an island by yourself? Did you have a girlfriend on there or anything?
No. I had a pet goat named Glenn, and a little pig named Hillary that would follow me around as I went and caught coconuts and did my thing every day. And
was there
that was
pornography in those days?
No pornography in those days.
You had a magazine, didn't
no
you?
magazines, no internet. You know, cute little goat was about as pornographic as it got, and that wasn't my thing. So Yeah, there was a lot of opportunity to soul search and just sort of, and isolation is actually a good thing sometimes in your life. And I was in between a couple different jobs, and it was a nice time to reflect on life and be up there alone. And
how long were you on the island for?
about a month and a half.
Month and a half.
Yeah, and actually it was enough.
I'm going to tell you a story about, this started up in Kenya and Tanzania a couple of years ago. You know, in fact, I caught goats for a while when I was a kid. There was a period in New Zealand when goats become quite valuable, as on farms they started to shear the wool, but there was a total lack of goats. And so farmers suddenly started paying people to catch wild goats. And up until then, our Department of Conservation, goats aren't endemic to New Zealand, so they do a lot of damage. And Doc used to go on and pay guys to kill them. Suddenly, there's these farmers want these goats live, and so I used to go out with my twin brother, and we'd often drag a couple of homies in it, and we'd go out and catch these goats live. But they were hard to catch. If I'd known that thing about
flashlight
the torch
at night, a moonless night.
We used to get, sometimes we'd get $100 per goat.
Oh wow!
$100 a goat, like if it was woolly. Because some of them were quite woolly, which meant they had a bit of Angora in them.
Sure.
And then the straight hair ones might be only $20. Anyway, and I remember one time we were devastated when we spent a day chasing one goat, and it was kind of like that. It was a big goat, and they were tricky to corner.
Yeah.
You know, we had a few canyons and that, and but there was so what happened in Kenya and Tanzania was the locals there, and this is quite sad. They figured out they could use a torch and a horn, like those air horns. They go. And they would go out and they shine these torches at the animals at night, and then there's a second guy who sneaks up around the side. The animals, so they're chasing things like kudu, which is like a big deer. When they do the horn, the kudu can no longer hear the guy sneaking up from behind, and so it's a two-man team, one with a torch and horn shining at an animal sits there looking at him. The second guy goes up behind, and he would, if it's a big animal like a kudu, he would hack into the Achilles tendon on the back of the legs, and then the animal can run away on two legs, or sometimes three. And then but they get exhausted so far, and you know, in fact we might be going to Kenya later this year to go working on that. But
and that technique is rampant now, right?
Yeah, so the first I heard of it was 3 years ago, and then now apparently there's a lot of animals being caught using that, which is really sad. And as you know, man is so clever. In fact, you see the same thing in fishing. Man gets cleverer and cleverer at how he manages to go catching animals, and like humans are enormously smart, but we're sort of enormously dumb at the same time in terms of, I think we're dumb collectively. You know, we're kind of smart to figure out, hey, let's go blast fishing. You know, let's use dynamite, or let's use cyanide, and we can catch more fish. But in the long term, as a collective, it's toxic.
Very true.
So it's interesting. You figured out the torching. Or did someone else? Did you figure?
No. A Filipino guy actually taught me. He came up for the first weekend and taught me where to find the monitor lizards, and he taught me how to make hearts of palm and where to catch the coconut crabs, and were the basic staples. And then he just left me there and said, "Okay, now you're on your own."
Goat catcher.
Goat catcher. But beautiful animal.
But you never caught the big billy.
I never caught him. In fact, after that, after he came and hit me in the back, I had a vengeance to go after him, and I spent a lot of time in the daytime. And I had him one time where he was on a really steep cliff, and I kind of risked my life to try to get closer to him, to try to corner him in an area. But in the end of the day, he's probably still running free up there somewhere. And that was a good adventure.
Did food dominate your day?
No, it was maybe anywhere from 40 minutes to 2 hours a day of food collecting. And the advantage is we called it the shopping center because the fish there had never seen a human being before. And so we'd jump in the water, and I'd have big parrotfish and big jacks and stuff would just swim right up to me because they'd had no fear of human beings. So it was pretty much, I could decide what fish I wanted to eat. There was tide pools there with 5 kilo grouper and I could just go in and pick lobsters out of the tide pools because there was just no human presence.
We had the last Pacific crossing I did, so we went from Panama all the way across the Pacific, and we had some obligations in Australia at the time, but that was like 2.5 months away, so we had 2.5 months to cross the Pacific. And what I did was I picked atolls on the charts that had no man on them. So normally on the marine charts you can not always, there was a couple of islands we went to that had people on them, but I think we ended up with about 8 or 9 that had no one living on them. and there was probably half a dozen had a really nice anchorage, so you could pull in. I'd just leave one of the crew on the boat. Would put a bit of food and a sea biscuit, swim ashore, set up the hammocks. I'd go and spear a couple of fish. Crew would go and get some coconuts and mangoes and pawpaw, whatever was growing there. And those, you know, it's when it was probably the most extraordinary voyage I ever had on Earthrace. It was an amazing voyage, and I know, you know, the crew afterwards, you know, we were like, you know, we will never have such an amazing time as this again in our life. And that, you know, that there is something pretty special about that living on an island where you're the only people on there and you kind of have it to yourself. The crazy thing with it, most of the time we had no idea, you know, we're not clearing customs or anything like that, you know, part of Micronesia, part of Vanuatu, part of, you know, we just rock in and own this island, not like there's a customs official sitting there waiting for you. But I did find that food tended to dominate the time there. Like you'd come in and it takes you a while to figure out where are those pawpaw trees and you know, whatever you're trying to find out. And food occupied a big part of the day, and the preparation and ceremony around it, and having the coffee first thing in the morning. You know, that was the startings of the jungle barista back then. Okay. my job was to do the coffee in the morning.
You know, another thing that's really interesting about having that experience and going to these pristine places that are very little human impact is to see what the baseline is like in a pristine environment, and then to come to a place like the Philippines, which has a lot of human influence. And time and time again, I've seen people jump in the water and see a reef ecosystem with maybe 1% of the biomass, and then be amazed at seeing 3 damselfish. And if they had ever jumped into a pristine Micronesian atoll and seen clouds of fish where you can't even see the surface of the water, and seen large, you know, hundreds of sharks on a single dive, I think that's what's missing in people's perspective about how much has been lost, and especially in places like the Philippines.
I guess that, you know, that kind of leads into, you know, for those of you out there, we were lucky enough, we went and dived Upper Reef, which would be the second best dive site and for all of Philippines, most really. And keep in mind, you know, Philippines is in the middle of the Coral Triangle, sort of on one side of the Coral Triangle, and historically is one of the richest waterways in the world. So we went and dived this the other day, and it was really disappointing.
It really was. It really brings home when you hear that coral reefs are dying around the world from thermal stress related to climate change.
So thermal stress related to climate change, that is warm water. So corals have an ideal temperature, I think runs between maybe about 24 and 28, is that right? Which so 24 to 28 degrees Celsius in Fahrenheit, 24, 48, 78, plus, 78 to maybe 95 or something. So that's your ideal range. If it gets warmer than that, they start to have problems. So you've seen in the Great Barrier Reef, you know, I think 40% got killed off in the last year or two. And Great Barrier Reef was in Australia in the southern hemisphere. The warmer water comes from the north and moves south. So the northern part of Great Barrier Reef is shot. You know, there was this turkey there, Pauline Hanson, who was your equivalent of a right-wing Ku Klux Klan racist, xenophobic. She used to run a fish and chip shop, and now she's a senator. Anyway, she went out there and she went to some place in the south of the Great Barrier Reef, pulls up a piece of dead coral and sees, see, the Great Barrier Reef is fine. There's plenty of coral still here. And she is holding up a dead piece of coral in a section that actually hasn't really been affected that much by climate change or by water temperature. But anyway, let's go back to Upper Reef. You've dived there quite a few times.
I have, and I've seen a lot of incredibly beautiful reefs around the Philippines, and I was shocked. We parked out. We didn't anchor. We were just drifting and swam into shore and dove a couple different spots on the northwest corner. And I would say that the mortality amongst the coral there was 90%. You know, the fan corals, the branching corals, the more sensitive to heat stress, they were all dead. And there was only the pyrotes and a couple other of the resistant corals to heat that had survived. And fish populations were still decent, but without the food supply from the corals, you're going to see a big decline in the butterfly fish. And did a little research on it, and I found out that there was a major bleaching event there in May of 2016. So it was 2 years ago that they had a major bleaching, and I hadn't been there in 2 years. So this actually, you look at the coral and you saw how much
Could it have been just caused by that tornado that came through?
The typhoon would have caused physical damage.
What's the difference between a typhoon and a tornado?
A lot. I mean, tornado is a twister.
Okay.
Typhoon is a storm system. You know, not the funnel cloud. You know, a tornado is obviously different than a hurricane or a typhoon, but it's northern, southern hemisphere.
What's the difference between a hurricane and a typhoon?
Storms in the Atlantic are called hurricanes, and typhoons is Pacific, and cyclones the Indian Ocean, right?
Cyclone. In fact, the difference between a hurricane and a cyclone is the direction, because one's northern hemisphere and one's southern. So in southern, this is due to what?
Coriolis Effect.
Coriolis Effect. There you go.
I feel like I'm on a quiz show here.
Jeez. So the Coriolis Effect is the thing. If you have a few people, their eyes are going to glaze over here. So if you imagine you've got a record player spinning, and you stand a little wee soldier up on the record player, as the thing spins around, the soldier falls out. That is the Coriolis Effect, and that drives a lot of the weather patterns in the world. So it's that rotation and the acceleration that's caused by this object going like this. Around the equator, it doesn't exist. So this is what makes, when you drain water out of a sink, it goes one way in the northern hemisphere, it reverses in the southern, and so the hurricanes go what direction?
Clockwise.
A hurricane is going to go clockwise. No, it goes anti-clockwise. In the southern hemisphere, a cyclone. Oh, you could be right. I'm trying to figure out. I don't know. We don't want to go there. Anyway, it goes one direction, northern hemisphere. Southern hemisphere goes a different direction.
And right at the equator, it doesn't spin either way. It goes.
There's no spinning.
Yeah, no spinning.
So you tend to find that hurricanes and cyclones and stuff that begin close to the equator, where there is plenty of heat. To generate these big systems, but they never cross the equator. They generally start up south or north of the equator and then often spin south. And we're going to see a lot more of them with climate change, increased heat and whatever.
And so just to wrap up on Apo Reef, I think the extent of devastation there was not something I would have never expected to see at that level, and it is an indication that we are losing huge pristine reefs, you know, not 1 or 2% at a time, but 50, 70%. Now the good news, I have a bit of good news here, is that we did see brown slicks of film that were on the top, and I consulted Gregor Hodgson over at Reef Check to ask him, you know, to confirm what that was, and I suspected it was the decaying coral. And he said it's just the opposite. This time of year, it's most likely the healthy coral that's spawning, and that's actually a good sign. So there is some coral there, maybe on the other side of the reef, maybe in deeper water. And that was accumulation of the coral spawn there on the surface. So there
I thought it was an oil slick. I first saw this thing, there's an oil slick.
Yeah.
It's funny with this Apo Reef. So it's my first time diving there. And I've dived a lot of great reefs around the world. So I've dived Palmyra and Minerva and Cocos Island and that. And I've really been looking forward to Apo Reef. And it was devastating to see how shit it was. Here's something I was thinking about the other day though. In the long term, I kind of think that the Philippines coral ecosystem is sort of doomed. Like it's worse, probably the worst place in the world that is affected by the heating oceans. You know, like if you look at the way that heat is starting to funnel in here, like it's warmer than pretty much anywhere else in the tropics. And part of it, I think, is the shallowness of it. Well, there was a heat map. I don't know if you see.
Yeah, and when you look at the Red Sea, obviously is warmer than some of the areas around here. And they have more heat-resistant corals, but the area that's been most affected globally is the Caribbean. When you look at coral reef decline, their coral reefs have really been decimated, and there's still a lot of places in the Philippines. Even though I think it was WWF that actually placed about 1% of the corals in the Philippines still in excellent condition.
1%?
1%. Wow. But then 96% is being threatened from, 98% is being threatened from human activity, for destructive fishing and techniques.
Here's something that I would suggest is going to happen, is that you will start to find that they will become less diverse. So there are some corals that are a little bit more heat resistant. I think there may also be a function of being resistant to the acidity. You know, I know corals don't like the water getting slightly more acidic, which is happening. But with time, let's say the coral ecosystem in Philippines gets completely shot. It still can be a healthy reef ecosystem. You know, it won't have the same level of diversity and biomass that it might have had 50 years ago. But it's not to say it's going to end up with zero. But for that to happen, they do need to get on top of their illegal fishing and overfishing. I'd suggest both are. Let's touch briefly on, because you've been here for how long?
18 years.
What was it like when you first got here?
There wasn't as many foreigners. Now there's a lot of the business process outsourcing sector, and you see foreigners all over Manila. But back in those days, I think there was a real special treatment, you know, and Filipinos are incredibly hospitable and friendly in general. But back then it was, I felt more like a pioneer, where now it just seems like it's more of a multicultural society. Especially, you know, after the call center days, I bought a big boat and went around the Philippines for 2 years straight, and then I owned the boat for 9 years, and I would go to islands.
What sort of boat?
It was, we called it a yanca, which is a combination of a yacht and a banca, and so it was a big 114-foot long trimaran with a crew of 7, and we threw a jacuzzi in there and made it kind of like a floating
114 foot, that's about 5 meters for those of you in the rest of the world.
Yeah, so it was a floating platform where the infrastructure in these remote places in the Philippines just wasn't there. There was no hotels, there was no food, there was no whatever. So having your own boat and being able to bring everything with you, and, you know, 5 of your best surfing friends and whatever, and go to these remote places to explore, was really a special experience in my life.
I saw that you had a couple of magazines in there with photos of. So you would pick up these surfy sort of surfers from around the world and give them
Well, it was like Billabong and Quicksilver, and these companies would sponsor these new up-and-coming surfers to go to never before ridden waves in the Philippines. And we've discovered over 200 new breaks from southern Mindanao all the way up to Taiwan, mainly on the east coast of the Philippines, where we would pull up to a spot and see a perfect right-hander peeling over a reef, and then we'd talk to the local villagers and say, have you ever seen anybody surfing here? And they said, no, you know, we've never seen anything like this before. And the beaches would be full of crowds watching us ride these waves, and that wasn't just 1 or 2 spots. That was literally, you know, over 200 spots that we put on the map.
Have you still got that boat, the Yanka?
No, it sank in a typhoon. So after 9 years, we were on a surfing trip, not too far from here in Batangas, and I had a couple local surfers on board, and it was a shear line that came in, and the wind shifted, and we had a starter failure, and we dragged 2 kilometers, and a 8-foot wave lifted the boat up and put it to rest on the reef. So that was a noble warrior's death for a boat that had a lot of great memories. No insurance, which was pretty brutal. But
what was the boat worth?
I don't know, maybe a couple $100,000. You know, it depends on the buyer. Maybe anywhere from maybe $500,000 to $200,000, depending on, again, it wasn't a brand name boat, and it had some issues. All wood.
Had some issues.
Yeah, and termites.
I tell you, that's when you're a boat person. Oh yeah, that boat had some issues.
Well, the big 3208 diesel engine was in really good shape, but it was a 10,000 liter fuel tank, which every time we'd fill it up, it was like buy a used car or just put another tank of fuel. So then, for my next boat, I really wanted to build a boat that ran on renewable energy. I wanted to build a boat that you could just charge from the sun and run off batteries, and we never had to go and fill it up at a gas station ever again, and that's what we did.
I've seen this boat actually. He's got, just down the bottom here, he has this solar powered boat, and it's got little wee electric motors in each outlet. A very unusual design. It is a unique boat, trust me on that. I've seen a lot of boats around the world. I have never seen a boat. Hopefully we can get some footage off them. That'll
sure.
We might go down and film it
later.
What
we did is we recycled the outriggers from the 114-foot boat to make the hulls of this one, and the only thing that really survived the other boat were the outriggers and the jacuzzi. The jacuzzi float.
So those are the outriggers off the original boat? Oh,
which was only about, you know, 2/3 of the length of the boat, or no, about half the length of the boat. So you can imagine the 114-footer was significantly larger.
It'll be interesting to get someone like Craig Looms, who's the naval architect of my boat, to get him to have a look at it from a technical perspective, to see. You know, he's never going to come over here, but you know, it does look like you've done an amazing job for someone who's not a naval architect. You basically designed that boat and built it and put it together. Presumably, brought a bunch of locals in to go. Getting it.
We sketched it on the back of a napkin and just sort of eyeballed it, and when we put it in the water, it sat perfectly level, which was the amazing part. You know, that we didn't have it that weight-wise, it was perfect, and. The other things, the reason why the design, we wanted to have really long, slender hulls, and so it slipped through the water with very little horsepower. And I think the biggest problem with the boat is bridge deck clearance. You know, we wanted to have about 1.5 meters, and it's got about a half a meter. It's sinking a little bit lower than we expected, and so it's probably not so good in heavy seas, but it's a great coastal houseboat to move around the coast and sit in protected anchorages. And
so when he's talking about efficient boat, when you're with boats, size does matter.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of blokes tell you it doesn't matter. It does actually matter. And what you're talking about is long, skinny hulls are more efficient than short, fat ones. And waterline length. So this is why the most fuel efficient way to move goods around the planet is on a boat that goes slow. But the longer the vessel, the less horsepower per ton it takes to push it through the water. So the only reason I know this, we covered it in Earthrace when we were doing the round the world speed record. And to get the record, really the longer you make the boat, the less horsepower per ton to take to push it through the water. And so that boat of yours, a very slippery hull shape, like these two really long, skinny, they're not really outriggers, they're two long, skinny catamaran hulls.
And normally catamarans have the living space in the hull, so then it has to be 2.5 meters wide, but ours at the waterline is only a meter.
We better move on from boats. There'll be a few of them out there that their eyes are glazing over about now. As soon as I start talking technical stuff, what else? So that covers you. Tell me a little bit about this work on corals that you were doing. It's a fascinating story over how you managed to grow corals. Yeah,
so it started out we wanted to figure out ways to rehabilitate damaged coral reefs. So yeah, I poured myself into researching different technologies, and I looked at basically 3 generations of coral building technology. And back in the 70s, they would just dump cars and tires in the ocean and call it an artificial reef. And that was kind of a big failure. And then the second generation was these reef balls made out of 400 kilogram concrete things, which didn't actually grow coral, but provided decent habitat for fish. And then about 20 years ago, a guy by the name of Tom Grow invented with Wolf Hilbert's a technology using electric...
The irony in that name, Tom Grow.
Tom Goro.
Yeah. Oh, Goro. Yeah. Okay, I'll take it back. It's not that ironic, really.
But they were developing a technology to grow limestone in the water as a substitute for concrete. But then they found that around their limestone, the corals were growing really at an accelerated rate, and their survival rate and everything was much better. So Tom carved out from Secrete, he carved out biorock. And I went to Bali. I visited a half a dozen artificial reef programs, and I pretty much concluded that it was a gigantic waste of money. And the amount of effort it took and whatever, the results were really underwhelming. And then I went to Pemuteran in northern Bali, and I saw a biorock installation with about 70 or so structures, and I was blown away at the growth of the coral, the biodiversity, the natural look of the structures after they had mature growth. And that's when I attended a class by Dr. Garreau, and then came back and set up, this is 2013.
And what's the key to it?
The key is electricity. So it's a tickle of electricity that it creates ionic field between a cathode and an anode. And just like the limestone that deposits on your faucet in your sink, it accelerates that natural deposit of ocean minerals onto a metal frame. Once the minerals have deposited on the metal frame, the frame stops rusting, so you don't have the issue of that falling apart. But it makes the water slightly more alkaline around the dome, around the cathode, and a higher oxygen content. So in hypoxic environments, fish seem to like those environments better. The higher alkalinity makes it easier for corals to form their skeletons, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest during bleaching that they survive when equivalent sample reefs just nearby are dying.
Okay, so you put electricity onto a steel structure and it accelerates coral growth through various mechanisms.
Superior substrate for this natural recruitment to occur, and it actually accelerates growth. On the acroporas and branching corals, maybe 6 to 8 times faster. And in fact, it grows so fast you have to graft it and break it off and add more fragments around. And it's actually a very pleasurable experience. Anybody who actually enjoys gardening would really enjoy being on a coral reef and growing their coral garden. And we found that it engages communities, fishing communities that normally didn't even know the coral was alive. They just thought it was a rock. And now they're seeing the connection between healthy coral reefs and fish, and they're seeing a connection between alternative livelihoods with ecotourism, being dive guides, using their boats instead of for fishing, but to bring people to the Bio Rock reefs.
Yeah.
And in some of the locations, it was dynamited, and now we're seeing 20 boats a day, and this is income that is 10 times more than what the people were making with hook and line fishing in a depleted fishery.
Cool. Are you a gardener?
A little bit. I've got a garden out in front, and you can see there's a little garden here and a little garden out in front, and I enjoy it. I like getting my hands dirty. I like watching things grow.
When I was about probably 10 or 11, I suddenly had this dream. I'm going to become a gardener, and I went and planted radish.
Okay.
And then I remember making radish sandwiches, and I didn't like them. And so then I thought, what's the point in growing these things? And I really loved watermelon as a kid.
Okay.
It was before I discovered mangoes. I love mangoes. They're probably my I think mangoes and pomegranate, which I'd never tasted pomegranate. There was a girlfriend a few years ago who taught me about pomegranate.
Okay.
I was in Los Angeles and she introduced me to pomegranate, and I was like, where have you been all of my life? So anyway, after that is the last thing I've ever grown was some radish, put them in a sandwich, found they tasted disgusting, and that was the last thing I actually grew.
There's nothing more satisfying than growing your own food and making a salad and going out to the garden and picking your food for that meal that day, whether it's a cucumber or a squash or something like that. Not only do you know it's really healthy and not done with pesticides and GMOs and everything, but just the flavor is so much better.
Said as a gardener.
Yeah. And then the gardening aspect of the Bio Rock reefs is if you're going to the same reef every day, you start realizing that fish are sentient beings. You start seeing that they recognize your face, and there's been scientific studies that they actually can recognize people's faces. And I started naming all the fish on our reefs. There's Maria and Stan and Cheska.
Was there any naughty fish?
Yeah, well, the wrasses in particular, they get up in your business when you're actually tying the fragments on, and they got some pretty sharp teeth, so they'll kind of nip at you and stuff like that when trying to get into where you're working. And
have you ever had any massive fish come in, a massive groper or anything?
Nope, nothing, not one. In fact, it's over 180 dives at that location, and we haven't seen one shark in 180 dives. Not one reef shark, nothing. So it's a seriously depleted ecosystem, but the coral itself is in pretty good shape. It's just severe overfishing, gill nets. These have caused massive imbalances into the ecosystem.
I want to touch very briefly on the types of illegal fishing that happen. Like, you've been here 18 years, and over that period of time, one of the things I find is the illegal fishing and illegal poaching and hunting and these things. New things become almost fashionable, and everyone starts doing this, and then they start to realise, oh, hang on, if we go using dynamite, it's not so good. And sometimes you'll see communities take ownership of that, and then there's the next thing, and the next thing. I want you to tell me, what are the different forms you've seen over the years? So
the evolution of illegal fishing methods here in the Philippines really started in the 1950s, right after World War II, with dynamite and cyanide fishing. Then the Japanese actually introduced another form of illegal fishing. Well, at the time it wasn't legal, called mura-ami, which was a technique where they would get a whole line of people with strings and rocks, and then the kids on the surface would lift the rocks up and down and bang the reef to herd the fish, and not just fish, everything on the reef into these large purse seine nets. So if you combine, dynamite fishing is still rampant, just in this location in Cebu, Batangas. At one point, we were seeing over 100 dynamite blasts per day in an area of maybe 10,000 hectares, 20,000 hectares. It isn't uncommon. In fact, I had a friend from Schmidt Marine out here just a month ago, and we heard 6 dynamite blasts in one hour dive, and it's shocking. You've experienced dynamite underwater before, and it's like somebody's taking 2 garbage can lids and banging behind your head. And as a species with very poor hearing, it doesn't affect us so much, but you can imagine how it sounds to a dolphin or these other animals that are very sensitive hearing.
What about cyanide? Have you seen that at all here?
We don't see cyanide here as much. In Palawan, it's rampant. It's mainly for the live fish trade. Most of these fish are being stunned and then put in pens to grow into larger size to be more commercially viable to the live fish market in southern China, Guangzhou in particular.
We did a few missions in Palawan on the cyanide fish trade, and the larger fish, they inject them with amyl nitrate. Amyl nitrate, some of you might remember this going back a few years, amyl nitrate is speed, and it's the antidote for cyanide, and so it doesn't guarantee you survive, but it gives you a greater survival rate. And so what the fishermen were doing is they go down with these squeezy bottles, and they sort of squirt the cyanide in amongst the corals, and it stuns the fish or makes them a bit sleepy, and they'll often, sometimes by hand or sometimes with a little net, they'll grab the fish, take them to surface, inject them with amyl nitrate, and then put them in a live tank, and then they end up going to shore. And there were certain parts of Palawan, you know, most of the fish were being caught using cyanide, and then they get exported to China. And you know, the live fish trade is worth a lot of money to the Philippines and Indonesia.
It's and $1 billion a year industry, and just
you know, and cyanide is very toxic on the coral ecosystems. And you know, you're selling a fish that has been poisoned with cyanide. You know, like.
You don't think you want to eat that, right?
No, no.
But the interesting thing, there was one company called Cleveland Chemical that actually imported something like 9 million kilograms of sodium cyanide to Palawan alone. And back about 6 to 8 years ago, we were involved in a study with Conservation International and a group of lawyers called ELAC in northern Palawan, where they estimated some 2,400 boats that were engaged in just one little area of northern Palawan every day in sodium cyanide fishing. So. They hypothesized something in the neighborhood of 250,000 instances of sodium cyanide fishing over 2 years. And then they looked at 8,000 times somebody complained and said, hey, they're using dynamite. 12 arrests out of 250,000 incidences of using it, and of the 12 arrests after 4 years, 0 convictions. So one of the challenges in the Philippines is the lack of enforcement as a negative incentive for doing these illegal activities.
Yeah. I think in the long term, the Philippines does need to get on top of enforcement here. All right. Any other forms of illegal fishing you've come across?
The large commercial operations. I mean, the Filipinos are some of the best fishermen in the world, and I say that as a compliment, but it doesn't bear well for the environment here. So, just recently we were out for the last 2 weeks, and we saw not one variety of illegal fishing, we saw half a dozen different techniques that are being used.
There's one of the great things they've done here is they have banned the big commercial boats from what they call municipal waters, which is anywhere within 15 k's of land, kilometres. But the backside of that is that a lot of the commercial boats go ignoring those laws. But you know, you realise how important the fishery is here when you just see the sheer volume of guys out there with their little hand lines and little wee canoes. And I remember a couple of years ago, no, last year it was, at this time last year, I was in this little place called Tigboam, which is on an island called Iloilo, and there was this, we were doing some enforcement with a local ranger, and this little old man came past us in a canoe, one of those little trimaran canoe things, and he was, and we sort of yelled out to him, we said, hey, what are you up to? And he completely ignored us, which is normally a warning sign when people ignore you when you're doing enforcement. Like, in fact, you saw it the other day with those guys who were pretending they were asleep. And because they were doing naughty stuff. So they were pretending they were asleep. So this guy completely ignored him. So I figured this guy's guilty of something. Let's go and... Anyway, so we pull up alongside this guy. He's 83 years old. 83 years. And he is 5 nautical miles offshore. And he started fishing when he was 9, and he said basically he's been full-time fisherman. He was deaf as well, so we had to yell at him, and he only understood Tagalog, so we had the local guy, and this conversation took about half an hour. You know, hey, whoa. Anyway, it was an amazing story. But this guy, he talked about how he used to be able to go out and catch around 20 kilos of fish in the space of an hour or two. And he said now he would go out, he would spend about 8 hours a day, he reckoned out on this, and when the weather would permit. And he said sometimes he would come back with only 1 or 2 kilos.
It's a common story.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons I do fear a little bit for the future. You know, if you take the Philippine population, in the space of 50 years, it's gone from 25 million to over 100. And the Philippines enormously depend on their fishery. But you imagine, you know, I've been with you now for a couple of weeks, and when we're having basically the meals that the locals have, it's fish and rice. Fish and rice. You take fish out of that diet, then they're eating rice.
And there's no supermarket to go to. There's no savings account to go buy food at the store. It's basically they live in subsistence way of life, and that's about half the population, with 60% of the animal protein coming from fish for the population. So you can imagine when that food supply collapses, where do the people go? And over again they come to the cities. And so you've got this influx of people coming into the cities without the government resources to support these people, and it's human misery on a scale that is hard to see.
It's been noticeable too when we look at the illegal fishing we've seen here, and I go back to, you know, when I came here last year and did some work. You get close to the very poor big cities, there's rampant illegal fishing, and I think poverty is one of the key drivers of this. If you take, for example, Cavite, you know, very poor city, you know, relatively large population, so much illegal activity around there, and you get to the places that don't have so much poverty, generally less illegal activities going on.
Absolutely. And that's very true about looking at the countries around the world. Those countries that have the wealth to manage their fisheries better do much better job. They go to New Zealand, or go to the Scandinavia, or go to Canada, and you can see that the higher the corruption rating, the lower the per capita income, the higher the prevalence of illegal fishing. So I mean, other legal methods. One method that doesn't get enough attention here is nets. And you know, people say, oh, that's a traditional fishing technique. You know, monofilament nylon is a modern invention. And it's the sheer number of nets and the mesh size. I think the minimum size is like 1.2 centimeters here, which is, you know, basically like your pinky fingernail. And so these are indiscriminate killers that get everything. And especially at night, where the fish like to move around the reef and forage, if you're seeing a 200-meter long gill net that goes from the surface to the sea floor every 500 meters, it's just a gauntlet of death. So, you know, the difference between, again, diving on in an area where they've had a lot of nets, and the nets get even shells walking along the bottom, jellyfish. It's that feeling of emptiness.
Remember this time last year when I was over on Iloilo,
yeah,
and there was the guy Ramel who I was working with, so he was the local fish warden, and he said, oh, we've got a really interesting thing down on the beach, come and check this out. So we went down there, and the community had a net, and it would have been, I would guess, under a centimetre mesh size, and which technically was illegal, but the local people had sort of argued that because of poverty they wanted dispensation. And I think that's one of the problems the Philippines has. Like the national fisheries introduce a thing that says no commercial fishing inside 15 kilometres, but then local governors or whatever, through maybe it's a little bit of corruption, or maybe it's he's a friend of mine, I'll issue this guy, and once they go introducing exceptions, other people want the exception as well. So in this community there's, you know, they went and put out one net, and then, you know, next door it's happening as well, and next door. So all of these people go and argue poverty or whatever, and like they are poor people, and it's something that gets reinforced to me time and time again, is it's really complex. You know, I might put a video up that talks about, you know, some illegal fishing or something. Everyone's like, yeah, arrest them,
get them,
kill them, whatever. You know,
it's not so
you know,
cut and dry.
And you know, the destructive fishing has to stop. But it's really complex. And I think the Philippines long term, I really hope they can get on top of their fisheries enforcement here, because if you just simply look at it as a maximum sustainable catch, what's happening at the moment is they're driving it under that point. They're well under that now. And so when you look at the total volume of fish they can harvest per year, it's tiny compared to if they have saved their fishery back up at this level here. But it's not a case of evil people.
Not at all.
They're people trying to feed their families. And increasingly, I think the biggest problem we have is actually population growth, and not simply to point the finger at Philippines, but most countries around the world have growing populations. Where's all that food coming from? You know, a lot of it's coming from the Philippines, and it drives things like illegal fishing, because you want to go and catch more and more and more. I think there was I'm not sure that was you. Someone was saying about the Philippines that a lot of their fish actually gets exported. Like, you've got 100 million people wanting to eat fish, and yet a big chunk of it's heading to Europe and North America.
And there's reports of, you know, 60% of it is consumed here, but then when you actually dig down in the statistics, and especially in the tuna fisheries in southern Mindanao, a lot of that fish is being exported back to China, and then from there to the world.
Why does it go to China?
Processing. and export. You know, they're more export driven, and they've got the processing there. But
people on $5 a day filleting fish.
Yeah, but the other thing is that there's a lot of ambiguity in the local fishing laws too, and that ambiguity makes it difficult to do enforcement. And one example is when you were mentioning nets, and you know, they have a specific kind of fish that's seasonal, like a bully now, which is this little tiny fry that they need a really small net to catch. So now if you catch somebody with a tiny mesh size, the fisherman just needs to say, oh, I'm fishing for that kind of fish. And there's a lot of incidental bycatch, even turtles and dugong and these big animals that are caught in there. And then they say, well, it'd be a waste just to throw it away. And so there is no real strict enforcement on bycatch. And so it's almost
saw that. I
intentional.
remember one of the very first episodes we did of television was we flew this drone out over a marine reserve in Guanacaste, which is in Costa Rica, and we found that there was rumours of the illegal trawler coming in at night. We finally spotted him in the drone, took our sea legs out there and climbed aboard his boat, and he had a permit for shrimp fishing, but his targets, he was actually targeting snapper, but the fact that he was targeting shrimp, he had this really tiny mesh size, and it was legal what he was doing in terms of net size, but what was illegal about it was that he was zigzag this marine protected area. So we busted him for that. But when we went through his paperwork, he's a shrimp fisherman, but he wasn't targeting. When we went through his catch, you'd be lucky if it was 10% shrimp, but there was this huge amount of bycatch, and that was what he was after. And you know, it wasn't until later on we were talking with a local fisheries guy, and he explained, like, you know, that he's got a permit for shrimp fishing. That's what he's targeting, but really his target species was snapper and various other fish there. Complicated, eh?
Really, absolutely.
I want to touch very briefly on, there was the other day when we were heading down to Upper Reef, and we went by this island of Lebong, is that how you say
Lebong.
it? There's a fascinating story about that World War II soldier. Tell me about that.
Well, he was the last World War II soldier to surrender. So it's an island that's maybe 50 miles south of downtown Manila. And in 1974, he finally turned in his sword. And he'd been living in the jungle with 2 other guys for, you know, since the end of World War II.
So the end of World War II was 44, 45. So he'd been in there 30 years.
Refusing to acknowledge that it was the end of the war. And only if his commanding officer ordered him to stand down would he surrender. And he'd actually killed, what was it, 14? 30. So this Philippine soldier military
is running around on this tropical island, quite a big island.
Yeah,
actually.
50 miles south of Manila.
He's hidden in the jungle, and every time locals would venture into this section of jungle, he would shoot them, thinking that the war is still on. He's out there shooting the Filipinos. So, and this went on for 30 years, and then eventually there was a student. So the locals, of course, became fearful, and this
just
place,
let him do his own.
So he occupied this section of jungle, thinking World War II is still going. And then a student somewhere heard about him, went down with a loudhailer, and spoke to him in Japanese and said the war's over. And he comes back and he says, "I'm only going to surrender if I hear my commanding officer comes in and tells me." The student goes back to Japan, tracks down
this 90-year-old guy,
a 90-year-old commanding officer of this guy, who amazingly still alive. The commanding officer goes back there, gets back on the loudhailer and says, "Hey bro, the war's over. You know, you can come out and surrender." So then there's this delightful story. He comes out. So it started off, there was 3 of them, and one of them got shot and killed, and then the second one, this is how the story got out, genuinely what had happened. He did figure out, I've had enough of this shit, and he went and gave himself up, and that was how the story got back to Japan. But now this is the last guy, what was his name, Hiro something?
Yeah, Hiro Onada.
Anyway, so when the commanding officer goes back, Hiro decides to give himself up now because his commanding officer's told him to stand down, soldier. He comes out and he's still got his original uniform, and I might have had a couple.
And rifle,
he probably had
and
had no medals at that stage. He probably due a few. And his perfectly serviceable rifle, 30 years later, gave himself up, burst into tears. Beautiful. That'd be a great movie to be had.
Yeah, somebody will make a movie about it someday.
And there's rumours of a couple other soldiers who might still be in. They'd be getting pretty old now, though. And the life in the jungle is pretty hard. But when you're having to fosset for your food every day, and you might have a couple 100 rounds of ammo. You know, if he's shooting wildlife, he's going to run out of ammo sooner or later. Every now and then he's got to shoot a Filipino walking through, comes into his turf thinking war's still going.
Or raid some ammunition or something whenever he can get it.
It is, in some ways it's a great story, but it's tragic that that guy spent 30 years hiding in the jungle when he could have been out being productive.
You know, I think what's interesting about that story too is it shows that, you know, Philippines has over 7,100 islands. And when we went around for 9 years on my big boat, going to the most off the beaten path places, and there's still so much incredible mystery and beauty in the Philippines that have yet to be discovered. And I think that that just says it all. Mid-70s, that somebody from World War II could be living in the jungle 50 miles from downtown Manila, and
it's extraordinary, isn't it?
And it's still, he's living in a place that's still inaccessible and difficult to track him down. I mean, it's there are still places in Palawan and Mindanao where you really do, it could be 500 years ago. It's still really exciting.
I think as well, it highlights something about the persona of the Japanese people. Like 30 years later, this guy is still not going to give up until his CEO tells him, hey bro, the war's over. You know, like, can you imagine the Americans? It's like it's a couple of weeks gone, man. There's a surf.
Wait a second, there's cold beer over there?
Cold beer, there's a surf going on. Oh, I'm out of here, man.
I'm done.
And not to disparage the Americans in any way.
No, not at all.
But I think I remember my time in Japan when I did prison there. They were very unique people like that. And there's a lot of very admirable traits about the Japanese. And one of them is their loyalty and their dedication to the cause, almost blindly as well. You know, you go back to the kamikaze pilots in World War II. Okay, so we're going to load this plane full of bombs. You're going to fly it into a boat and kill yourself. And I don't think the Japanese, they're not doing it. If you take, for example, in Islam, where, you know, there's certain sections of Islam believe in martyrdom, and you go up to the equivalent of heaven and you get 72 virgins or something or other. I don't think the Japanese have it. It's not a religious thing. It's dedication to the emperor, or dedication to the greater good of the society. Sacrifice. Like that. That's a pretty unusual trait. And in the Japanese, stronger than any other people I've come across anywhere in the world.
There's a Japanese word that I like. It's called akinai, which means like you have this persistence of your duty, and you don't question it. You put your head down and you do your job. And that akinai is a way that, when you're having to face something that's really difficult, that you just accept it and move on.
In some ways, there's a danger with that. It becomes a cult. So you are placing your faith in your
leadership,
leader. You know, so you would hope that the leader has the right
idea.
All right. Let me just make sure we covered all the way there. We've done Labang, solar boat, coral restoration, goat catching. Anything else you want to cover?
Yeah, I think just the migration from moving to being an entrepreneur and spending my life trying to maximizing profits for investors to a life of trying to maximize.
Just tell me, the business you were running, what was that? What was it called?
So I've had two big startups here in the Philippines. One was called People Support. It was a call center. And we grew from, you know, a handful of employees to, I think last time I counted, it was like 42,000 employees, a NASDAQ
42,000?
Yeah. So it was one of the first call centers.
You sold that, didn't you?
Yeah, I sold it very early on in the business, and then ran it as president and CEO, and to about 8,000 employees, and then we had a NASDAQ IPO.
How much did you sell it for?
The IPO was about 186 million US. So from 0 to 186 in about 3 years, which was just at the right time, right place at the right time. I mean, most of that went to the investors, and at that point I was executive management, but not really participating on the upside.
You still did it right.
I did okay. It bought me a 114-foot yacht and afforded a lifestyle that will be difficult to compete with for about a decade.
There's the interesting thing in this. So you were making what by most people's standards was a truckload of money.
Yeah.
And then it's like you've swung away from the dark side.
Well,
how did that transition happen? Like
there was another company in
between. Just so you guys know, Scott has basically been working on coral restoration and environmental initiatives, various initiatives in the Philippines. When did that start full time for you? How many years ago?
We started the nonprofit in 2011, and then I sold everything and shifted to doing full time in 2013.
2013. So he's been doing it now for 5 years. Yeah. Why the transition?
I think I had sort of a, I don't know if you call it an aha moment or an oh shit moment, but we had been visiting one of my favorite reefs, and I hadn't been there in about 3 years, and it was a reef that wasn't on the charts, and I was taking a group of VIPs out there to show them my special reef. And when we arrived, the reef had just been laid waste by dynamite fishing. So it went from huge schools of barracuda and jacks and sharks and turtles to look like Hiroshima carpet bombed, you know, with just nothing left. And right after that, we started coming up with social initiatives within the company to donate money to World Wildlife and some of the other big NGOs. Bingos is what I call them, the big NGOs. And after a bit of auditing, we were finding that the money really wasn't going to the right causes. So then it was like, the government's not doing anything. These NGOs aren't getting the job done, so...
Should have come and seen me, mate.
Well, I did, and now we're working together. But the idea was that if you want to solve the problem, you need to get some entrepreneurs in there. And the idea was to take a kind of a business-like approach with performance management and metrics and technology, and see if I can't take this problem-solving ability in business. Because again, when you look at the call center, you know, this was a huge problem. In the United States, they were getting 100% turnover in call centers. The .com space was exploding with customer service demand, and there was just, at the time, the unemployment rate in the States was like 3%. So they just couldn't find anybody to work these jobs. A huge problem, which was solved by hiring English speakers in the Philippines and then using labor arbitration. So now we're at the same problem where we have to come up with sustainable business models where fishermen can now do an activity where they're financially motivated by conservation activity. You can't just ask people out of altruism to save the environment. It's got to be in their best interest.
Here's something that I'll put to you. I've sort of concluded there's roughly 3, maybe 4 ways you can get involved in. Let's say if your cause is conservation or human rights or animal rights or whatever, there's not a lot of people manage to do it full time in a sustainable kind of way. And you know, I get every day, I probably get over 5 emails, Facebook messages from people saying, hey, I want to come and help you save animals, or I want to come and help you, you know, bust poachers or whatever. But the really hard part is, you know, a lot of those people don't actually have many skill sets that would be useful to you. And the advantage someone like you has is you've run a business that employed 8,000 people, and you bring those skill sets, and that allows you to hustle. Like, you are a hustler. You know, I've been watching you on the phone there, and you're emailing, and you're making all that stuff happen, which has allowed you to go full time. And in many ways, I think you have created a niche for yourself. And I think that's a little bit what I've done, where you know the television show sustained us for quite a considerable period, and it meant I wasn't going around begging for money. The hard thing is, where does your money come from? In my case, it was this television show, and in your case, you brought on the skill set that allowed you to go and engage with, you know, CEOs of different businesses and foundations and other things. But it's very hard. The challenge with that is you're sort of the CEO, you're the marketer, you're the everything. You sort of where does your funding come from? And then, so one thing is funding, then you've got to go and do good work, because if you're not doing good work, no one's going to give you money. You know, there's a few scams going on where people don't actually do good work and they bring in lots of money. I look at some of the foundations who bring in truckloads of money, and I look at the pissy little output that they have. You know, a couple of banners stuck on the side of a building or something. Hang on, you guys pulled in how many million last year? So, you know, I admire the fact that you have created this niche for yourself, and you've made a success of it. But all credit to you. But
I would say that, you know, let's be clear, it has initial success. Society doesn't reward people who give up a selfish life of trying to make money for themselves, give up that to do environmental work. Society doesn't value that.
Yeah, but here's the thing. In a year of your life now, I would suggest it is a lot more rewarding than a year you had back when you were running that business with 8,000 people.
Yes and no. I mean, there was another digital media company in between there.
You still want all the money, don't you?
No, I mean, I think that in the beginning of a startup, when everything's going right, it's very satisfying. But then when you get to the grind of, usually there's this sort of growth spurt, and then there's the reality of trying to get to your exit, and there's this trough, and that's the really difficult part that can go from 1 to 5 to 8 years, and that part is miserable. So I would say that in the beginning of starting companies where you're creating new products and you're getting hyper growth, that's just as exciting as what I'm doing right now in terms of accomplishment and business side of things. But the feeling that there's meaning in the work that I'm doing right now is so much more fulfilling. And I think if we could create a class of environmental professionals, people who actually have a rating, instead of not just having a will to want to do good, but actually have skills to back it up, society should be readjusted in rewarding those people like we reward lawyers and investment bankers that are overpaid for what they do. They don't contribute anything to society. And we've got too many smart people developing software, starting internet companies, doing litigation as lawyers, or working in finance. These people, if we took their brain power and redirected it into solving some of the problems of the world, we would all be much better off.
Praise be to Jesus.
Praise be to Jesus.
Scott, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you here today, and thanks for sharing your inimitable stories. The Goat Catcher. If you ever need an African name, we're going to call you the Goat Catcher.
Okay, we'll figure out what the translation is. And thank you for making the effort to come all the way down here. I mean, the only way that we can be successful is through teaming and through people with complementary skills. And I can't do this alone. And if this is going out to your audience and there are people with project management skills, or marine biologists, or people that can fix outboard engines or want to rebuild electric boats, please send an email to
someone who can fix a fuel system.
We got that covered.
How many times did we have that back seat up?
Well, we had a problem with bad fuel here in the country, so we have primary and secondary filters, and we probably replaced those a dozen times.
All right. Anyway, Scott.
Again, thank you,
pleasure,
Pete.
Mate.
Please,
thanks a lot,
thanks for the time.
Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you share this, comment, bitch and moan, say what you want to say. See you next time. See you at the same time next year. We should come do this again.
Let's do it bigger and better next year.
And we will go through that story of yours, that one that got you in trouble on the boat.
Oh, which one?
Rightio. Bring it down, big guy.